My name is Vernon Keller, and I own exactly 37 two-headed cows. That number isn't arbitrary. It's not rounded for convenience. I can tell you the name, age, breeding history, and market value of every single animal in my herd because in the Mojave wasteland, Brahmin aren't just livestock. They're currency that breathes, capital that breeds, and the single asset standing between my family and the kind of poverty that kills slowly over generations. The brand burned into their toasted brown hides reads VK with a circle around it, registered with the NCR Land Management Office in Shady Sands for 200 caps, renewed annually for 50. That brand is more than identification. It's a legal claim, a property marker, and a warning to rustlers that these animals are accounted for in ledgers that the Republic's rangers take very seriously. Every Brahmin baron from California to the Colorado River knows that brand registration isn't bureaucracy. It's insurance written in scar tissue and backed by the threat of summary execution for cattle theft. I inherited 12 Brahmin from my father when he died of radiation sickness 8 years ago. The animals were worth roughly 400 caps each back then, which meant I started my adult life with 4,800 caps of walking, mooing assets, and absolutely no idea how to keep them alive long enough to matter. The Mojave teaches you fast or buries you deep, and ranching is no exception to that fundamental rule. Within 6 months, I'd lost 2 cows to deathclaw attacks, one to disease, and another to simple stupidity when it wandered into a radscorpion nest. My inherited wealth dropped to 3,200 caps before I learned the first rule of Brahmin economics. The market value means nothing if you can't prevent the assets from dying. Brahmin breeding follows patterns that make them simultaneously invaluable and maddeningly inefficient as investment vehicles. A healthy cow reaches sexual maturity around 18 months and can produce a calf roughly once every 14 months after that. Assuming proper nutrition, adequate water, and freedom from the various diseases that plague mutated livestock in post-nuclear environments. The gestation period runs 11 months, which is longer than most wastelanders' life expectancy and creates planning horizons that require thinking in terms of years rather than the day-to-day survival calculations that dominate most economic activity in the territories. The math of Brahmin reproduction becomes a complex calculation in delayed returns and compounding growth. That single calf represents between 800 and 1,200 caps of potential value. But only after you've invested roughly 200 caps in additional feed, medical care, and protection over the 14 months it takes to bring the animal to term and wean it. If the calf dies before reaching market weight, you've lost not just the potential sale value, but also the invested resources and the opportunity cost of what else you could have done with that money. If it survives and thrives, you've essentially generated a 40 to 60% return on investment, which sounds fantastic until you remember that you waited more than a year for it and that every moment of that year carried risk of total loss. I started selective breeding in my 3rd year of operation, having finally accumulated enough capital and experience to think beyond immediate survival. The goal was improving milk production in my females and increasing the muscle mass in males intended for meat markets. Brahmin milk sells for between 15 and 20 caps per gallon, depending on supply and demand fluctuations, and a good milk cow can produce 3 to 4 gallons per day at peak lactation. That's 60 caps daily from a single animal, which translates to 1,800 caps per month, which suddenly makes the cow worth more alive and productive than dead and sold for meat. The economics shift dramatically once you run those calculations. A breeding female in her prime productive years represents a revenue stream that can span 8 to 10 years before age diminishes her value below replacement cost. During that period, if you manage her health properly prevent disease, ensure adequate nutrition, and protect her from the various threats that prowl the Mojave. A single cow can generate over 150,000 caps in combined milk sales and calf production. That single animal becomes more valuable than most pre-war buildings, more important than any weapon in your arsenal, more critical to your family's survival than water rights or land titles. But that value only exists if the animal survives, and survival in the wasteland is never guaranteed. Deathclaws are the primary concern for any rancher working east of California. A single mature deathclaw can kill a full-grown Brahmin in under 10 seconds, disemboweling the animal with claws designed by pre-war biological weapons programs to be maximally lethal against anything short of power armor. I've lost 8 cows to deathclaws over the years, which represents 3,200 caps of vanished capital, plus all the future revenue those animals would have generated. The psychological impact of watching a year of careful breeding and resource investment get torn apart in moments never quite fades, no matter how many times you witness it. Radscorpions present a different threat profile. Their venom can kill a Brahmin in hours if untreated, and treatment requires anti-venom that costs 50 caps per dose. A single scorpion sting transforms into an immediate economic decision. Do you spend 50 caps to save an animal worth 400? Knowing that if the venom has already progressed too far, you've thrown away money on a corpse? I've made that calculation 17 times, and I've been wrong 4 times, which means I've spent 200 caps preserving assets and another 200 caps learning that sometimes the animal is already dead. It just hasn't stopped moving yet. Grazing rights in the Mojave follow patterns established by a combination of NCR legal frameworks, pre-existing territorial claims, and the simple, brutal reality that whoever can defend land gets to decide who uses it. My operation sits on 80 acres of scrubland northwest of New Vegas. Close enough to the city that I can reach markets in half a day, but far enough out that land prices haven't been inflated by urban expansion. I purchased the initial 40 acres for 800 caps 6 years ago, when the previous owner decided that dealing with fiends wasn't worth whatever profit he was extracting from the land. The fiends changed that calculation for me too, though I approached it differently. I spent 300 caps hiring guards to patrol my property boundaries during the first year, which cut into profits but kept the chem-addled raiders from treating my herd as a target practice or food source. After the third attempted raid, I invested in perimeter fencing, which cost 1,200 caps for materials and labor, but reduced guard costs by 2/3. The fence doesn't stop fiends who really want to get through, but it slows them down enough that response time becomes viable. And it keeps the Brahmin contained in ways that reduce losses from animals simply wandering off into dangerous territory. I expanded my holdings by purchasing the adjacent 40 acres 2 years later. And that's where Mojave land economics get interesting. The NCR Land Management Office maintains claim records, but enforcement depends on your ability to demonstrate continuous productive use of the property. If you can't prove that you're actually ranching the land rather than just sitting on it speculatively, competing claims can challenge your title through administrative hearings that favor whoever can show more intensive development. This encourages active ranching, but creates opportunities for larger operations to challenge smaller holders who lack the capital to maximize land productivity. Heck, Gunderson built his empire using exactly this mechanism. Hurricane Heck, they call him, and he earned the name through systematic campaigns of legal and extra-legal pressure against smaller ranchers. His approach follows a predictable pattern. Identify an underutilized parcel held by a rancher who's struggling financially, arrange for the Stockmen's Association to buy out the bank holding that rancher's debt, then call the loan due immediately while simultaneously filing competing use claims with the Land Management Office. The rancher, facing loan default and administrative challenges simultaneously, usually sells at a fraction of fair market value rather than fighting battles on two fronts that they can't win. I watched Walter Phebus lose his operation exactly this way. He'd been running bighorners on solid land with good water access. But 3 bad years of disease and predation left him over-leveraged and vulnerable. Gunderson's people moved in like cazadores on wounded prey. And within 6 months, Phebus went from independent operator to dispossessed, traveling to New Vegas with murder in his eyes and nothing left to lose. The efficiency of the process was terrifying, and the message to smaller ranchers was clear. Maintain productivity or lose everything to consolidation by the barons who have enough capital to weaponize the legal system. The Stockmen's Association operates as the political arm of the larger ranchers, nominally representing all cattle interests, but functionally serving whoever has enough wealth to buy influence in shady sands. Back when President Tandy was running the NCR, she maintained regulations limiting how many head any single rancher could own and how much land they could hold. Those limits kept the industry somewhat distributed, preventing the kind of baronial concentration that historically led to economic feudalism in pre-war cattle country. Tandy understood that healthy republics need economic distribution, not just political democracy, and she fought the association every year to maintain those protections. But Tandy's been dead since 2068, and her successors lacked either her principles or her political courage. President Peterson started eroding the regulations in 2069, caving to association pressure in exchange for campaign funding and political support. By 2073, when Aaron Kimball took office, the protections were already weakened to the point of meaninglessness. Kimball finished the job his first year in office, completely overturning the ownership limits and opening the door to unlimited consolidation by anyone with enough capital to expand. The past 12 years have seen the rise of the Brahmin barons as a distinct economic class, ranchers operating at scales that would have been illegal under Tandy's regulations. Gunderson runs over a dozen ranches spanning from California into Nevada, with herds numbering in the thousands and revenue streams that exceed the annual budgets of most settlements. He employs hundreds of workers, maintains private security forces that rival small military units, and exerts political influence through the association that shapes NCR policy on everything from land use to military deployments. The concentration of wealth and power creates market dynamics that squeeze smaller operators like me in ways both obvious and subtle. Gunderson can negotiate better prices with buyers because he's offering volume that makes him essential to their supply chains. He can undercut my prices on specific contracts because losing money on individual sales doesn't threaten his operation when he's profitable across dozens of other markets simultaneously. He can invest in breeding programs, water infrastructure, and security systems that would bankrupt me, but provide marginal improvements that compound over time into substantial competitive advantages. My survival strategy relies on finding niches that the barons either can't or won't service. I focus on local markets in New Vegas, where personal relationships and rapid response times matter more than volume discounts. I maintain quality standards that justify premium pricing to customers who want assurance that their beef comes from healthy, properly fed animals, rather than the bottom end of barren herds where sick and marginal livestock get mixed in with prime specimens. I diversify across milk production, meat sales, breeding stock, and hide processing so that downturns in any single market don't crater my entire operation. The Brahmin futures market operates out of the hub, though calling it a market is generous given how informal and trust-based most transactions remain. The basic concept involves contracts for future delivery of livestock at prices set in the present, which allows ranchers to lock in revenue and buyers to secure supply while transferring price risk to whoever guesses wrong about market movements. A buyer might contract to purchase 10 head in 6 months at 400 caps each, protecting themselves against price increases while giving me guaranteed revenue that I can plan around. If market prices rise above 400 by delivery time, the buyer gets a discount and I lose potential profit. If prices fall below 400, I'm protected from losses and the buyer overpaid relative to spot markets. I've used futures contracts 3 times, and I've come out ahead on 2 of them, which is good enough to continue the practice selectively. The challenge is that contract enforcement depends entirely on reputation and the threat of being blacklisted from future transactions. There's no formal legal structure ensuring that buyers actually pay or that sellers actually deliver. Everything runs on personal networks and the understanding that cheating once means never trading again, which works surprisingly well in communities small enough that everyone knows everyone else's business. The contracts also create opportunities for speculation by traders who have no intention of ever taking physical delivery of livestock. They're betting purely on price movements, buying contracts low and selling high, extracting value from volatility without ever actually handling a Brahmin. I find this practice parasitic and economically wasteful, but it does provide liquidity that makes it easier for actual ranchers and buyers to find counterparties willing to take the other side of our hedges. Inheritance laws around Brahmin ownership follow standard NCR property statutes with some livestock-specific modifications. Animals pass to designated heirs as part of estate settlements, which sounds simple until you factor in that Brahmin are living assets whose value changes based on health, age, breeding status, and market conditions between the time of death and the time of settlement. I've seen inheritance disputes tear families apart when siblings disagreed about whether to sell immediately or maintain the herd, with each side convinced the other was destroying their shared inheritance through short-sighted stupidity. Brand registration becomes critical during inheritance transitions because it's the legal proof of ownership that courts recognize when disputes arise. Without proper registration documentation, competing claims can emerge from relatives, business partners, or even neighbors who figure a confused inheritance situation offers opportunities to acquire livestock through aggressive assertions of alternative ownership stories. I keep my registration papers in a fireproof safe alongside my will, my land deeds, and the only pre-war photograph I have of my grandparents before the bombs fell. The brand itself needs to be distinctive enough that it can't be easily altered or confused with existing marks. The NCR maintains a registry of all approved brands, and applications require verification that proposed marks don't infringe on already registered designs. I've seen brands get rejected for being too similar to existing marks, forcing ranchers to redesign and reapply, while their unbranded livestock remain legally vulnerable to theft. The registration process takes between 4 and 8 weeks, depending on bureaucratic backlog, during which time you're operating in legal limbo where your ownership claims lack official standing. Brand falsification is a capital offense in NCR territory, and the rangers enforce it with enthusiasm that borders on religious fervor. They'll track rustlers across hundreds of miles, spending weeks on investigations that recover livestock worth less than the cost of the manhunt, because allowing brand fraud to go unpunished would destroy the entire legal framework that makes ranching viable. I personally witnessed a ranger hanging in Prim 5 years ago. 3 rustlers strung up for altering brands on stolen Brahmin. The rangers made sure every rancher in the territory heard about it, sending the message that property rights are sacred and violations will be punished with extreme prejudice. Water access drives land values in the Mojave more than any other single factor. Brahmin need between 10 and 15 gallons per animal per day, depending on temperature and activity levels, which means my 37 head require roughly 450 gallons daily. That's 13,500 gallons per month, 162,000 gallons annually, all of which has to come from somewhere that either costs nothing or costs little enough that profit margins remain viable. My operation sits over an aquifer that provides adequate well water, but the pump equipment costs 800 caps and requires regular maintenance that runs another 100 annually. Ranchers without natural water access face brutal economics. Hauling water by Brahmin caravan costs roughly 10 caps per 100 gallons after accounting for transportation labor and risk of loss during transit. For my herd size, that would add 45 caps per day, 1,350 caps monthly, 16,200 caps yearly, which would completely eliminate profitability and quickly bankrupt the operation. This reality creates water monopolies where ranchers controlling aquifers or reliable springs can extract rent from neighbors who lack independent access, charging fees that capture most of the value that the dependent rancher generates from their livestock. Some of the worst violence in the Mojave's ranching territories stems from water rights disputes. I know of 2 killings in the past 3 years, both involving conflicts over grazing patterns that brought livestock into proximity with water sources claimed by neighboring operations. The legal frameworks around water rights are a complicated mess of pre-war appropriation doctrines, NCR statutory law, and simple facts on the ground about who can defend access with sufficient force to make competing claims too expensive to pursue. The uncertainty means that water conflicts rarely get resolved through courts, instead festering into feuds that sometimes span generations and leave bodies scattered across the desert. Disease management represents another hidden cost that separates successful ranchers from the ones who go bankrupt, wondering where their capital disappeared. Brahmins suffer from various ailments that have no pre-war equivalents. Radiation-induced mutations that present symptoms veterinarians can't always diagnose or treat effectively. I've dealt with hoof rot that spread through 6 animals before I figured out the right treatment protocol, costing me 400 caps in lost productivity and medical supplies. I've seen respiratory infections that killed 3 calves in a single week, teaching me that early quarantine is worth more than any medicine once contamination reaches certain thresholds. The lack of formal veterinary infrastructure means most ranchers become amateur animal doctors by necessity and desperation. I learned to recognize bloat, identify mineral deficiencies, treat basic wounds, and perform emergency births through a combination of trial and error, advice from other ranchers, and reading pre-war agricultural texts that sort of apply to creatures that didn't exist before nuclear weapons rewrote biology. Every mistake cost me money and taught me lessons in the most expensive way possible. But the accumulated knowledge now represents competitive advantage that I can't easily quantify, but definitely feel an improved herd health metric. The Crimson Caravan Company represents the largest single buyer of Brahmin in the New Vegas region, purchasing livestock for their own transport operations and for resale to settlements, merchants, and other caravans. They run regular buying expeditions through ranching territories, offering cash prices for animals that meet their quality standards. The convenience of selling to Crimson Caravan is offset by their practice of lowballing prices, offering 300 caps for animals worth 400 on open markets. They know ranchers need cash flow and that finding alternative buyers requires time and transportation costs that often make the discount worth accepting. I've sold to Crimson Caravan twice, both times when I needed immediate capital for emergency expenses that couldn't wait for better offers. The first time was after deathclaw attacks killed 2 prime breeding cows, leaving me suddenly short on milk production revenue and needing to replace income quickly. The second time was when the NCR raised my land taxes unexpectedly, demanding payment within 30 days or face property seizure. Both times I accepted prices I knew were below fair value because the alternative was worse. And both times I resented the power imbalance that made exploitation economically rational for them and economically necessary for me. The White Glove Society at the Ultralux Casino represents the premium end of the beef market. catering to wealthy clientele who pay extraordinary prices for high-quality meat presented with theatrical sophistication. They're willing to pay 500 caps for prime animals that would fetch 350 on standard markets. But they're extremely selective about what they purchase and maintain relationships with only a handful of approved suppliers. Getting onto their vendor list requires connections, consistency, and the kind of quality control that most small ranchers can't maintain across all their livestock. Gunderson was negotiating a supply contract with the white gloves when his son disappeared at the Ultra Lux, which should tell you something about the scale at which barons operate. He was positioning himself to become their primary beef supplier, which would have given him pricing power that could squeeze out every smaller rancher selling to the casino market. The fact that he was willing to risk his son's safety by bringing him to Vegas during sensitive business negotiations shows how much money was on the table and how confident he was that his wealth provided protection against ordinary dangers. The contract would have been worth tens of thousands of caps annually, enough to justify the bribes, intimidation, and market manipulation that Gunderson deployed to eliminate competing suppliers. He was attacking other ranchers' Brahmin suppliers, sabotaging their operations so the white gloves would have no choice but to accept his terms or go without beef entirely. It was economic warfare prosecuted with mercenaries and lawyers. The kind of campaign that only becomes possible once you've accumulated enough capital that you can afford to operate at a loss in specific markets while maintaining profitability elsewhere. The bighorner market presents interesting economics because these mutated sheep can't be used as pack animals, unlike Brahmin, who can haul heavy loads. Bighorners just lie down under weight and refuse to move until you remove the burden, which makes them useless for caravans, but viable for meat, milk, and hide production in ways similar to Brahmin. Walter Phebus specialized in bighorners, running herds that competed with Brahmin ranchers for the same ultimate customers. The market dynamics are similar, though bighorner meat sells at slight discounts compared to Brahmin, because consumer preferences favor the familiar over the alternative. Gunderson runs both Brahmin and bighorners across his various ranches, diversifying his production in ways that insulate him from species-specific disease events or market fluctuations. If bighorner prices drop, he shifts emphasis to Brahmin operations. If Brahmin face widespread illness, he compensates through bighorner sales. The flexibility requires capital reserves that let him absorb short-term losses in specific segments, but it provides long-term stability that smaller specialized operations can't match. I'm locked into Brahmin because I lack the capital to diversify and the land to support multiple herds, which means species-specific risks are existential threats rather than manageable business challenges. The economics of scale in ranching create feedback loops that accelerate consolidation over time. Larger operations can negotiate better prices on feed, medical supplies, and equipment because they're purchasing in volumes that give them bargaining power. They can invest in infrastructure like fencing, water systems, and security that improves efficiency while requiring capital outlays that would bankrupt smaller ranchers. They can absorb losses from bad years, disease outbreaks, and market downturns that would force smaller operators into liquidation or debt spirals that end in foreclosure. These advantages compound over time, allowing large operations to grow even larger, while small operations struggle to maintain their position or slowly slide toward insolvency. The system doesn't require active malice from the barons, though many of them engage in it anyway. Simple math and market forces create drift toward consolidation, and the regulatory environment that might have counteracted those forces was dismantled by politicians serving the interests of the very people who benefit from concentration. I've watched 7 ranching operations within 50 miles of my land get absorbed by larger players over the past 8 years. 3 sold voluntarily to buyers offering prices that looked attractive compared to the grind of marginal profitability. 2 were foreclosed on by banks after years of declining revenue made debt service impossible. 2 were lost through land use challenges filed by neighboring operations with better documentation and deeper pockets to fund legal campaigns. Each consolidation removed a competitor and created slight market concentration that benefited everyone still operating, but contributed to the long-term trajectory toward baronial oligarchy. The question I return to constantly is whether my operation is viable long-term or just slowly dying through financial erosion that will eventually force sale or foreclosure. Some years I clear 5,000 caps profit after all expenses, which feels like success until I calculate that as a return on the 160,000 caps my herd and infrastructure represent. It's about 3% annually. I could probably earn better returns trading in New Vegas markets, but that would require liquidating the only assets I have and gambling everything on my ability to compete in domains where I have no expertise or relationships. The emotional calculation is harder to quantify. This land, these animals, this lifestyle represent continuity with my father's work and his father's before him. Selling out means admitting that our family's multi-generational investment in building something was ultimately futile, that we were just holding temporary position in a market that was always going to consolidate toward barren control, regardless of how hard we worked or how well we managed our resources. That admission carries psychological costs that don't appear in financial ledgers, but are as real as radiation sickness and sometimes more painful. My 37 Brahmin represent roughly 185,000 caps of total asset value when you account for their current worth plus the revenue streams they'll generate over their remaining productive lives. That's more wealth than most Mojave residents will see in their entire existence. Yet it feels simultaneously like prosperity and poverty. I'm wealthy compared to scavengers living hand-to-mouth in Freeside. I'm poor compared to barons who measure their herds in thousands and they're influenced by how many congressmen they've purchased. The relative position matters because markets are comparative, and I'm competing against people operating at scales I'll never reach. The future of small-scale ranching in the Mojave is probably terminal. The economics favor consolidation, the political system serves barren interests, and the NCR's expansion brings legal frameworks that benefit large operations over small holders. I'll probably maintain my operation until I'm too old to manage the physical demands, at which point I'll sell to whoever offers enough to fund a retirement that hopefully lasts longer than my savings. My children, if I have any, likely won't follow me into ranching because they'll recognize that the opportunity to build independent operations has been systematically eliminated by regulatory capture and economic concentration. But today, I still own 37 two-headed cows whose value to me exceeds their market price by margins I can't calculate. They represent autonomy in a world that increasingly denies it to anyone without barren scale capital. They provide livelihood that doesn't require taking orders from merchants, soldiers, or casino bosses. They connect me to land and work that feels meaningful in ways that transcend pure financial calculation. The math says I should sell and take whatever I can get before values deteriorate further. The math is probably right. I'm staying anyway. Every morning I walk my property line, checking fencing and watching for threats. I inspect every animal, looking for signs of disease or injury that need immediate attention. I calculate feed requirements, estimate water consumption, plan breeding schedules, and track market prices that determine whether my labor generates profit or just delays inevitable failure. The work is endless and the rewards are marginal. But it's mine in ways that wage labor or urban existence could never be. The Brahmin low their greetings as I approach, both heads turning toward movement with the synchronized independence that never stops being slightly unnerving. They've learned to recognize me as food source and caretaker, which is as close to affection as you get from animals whose emotional range centers around grazing and avoiding predators. I know each one's personality quirks, Which ones are skittish and which are aggressive? Which produce the best milk and which birth the healthiest calves? This knowledge represents accumulated capital that doesn't appear in official records, but determines success or failure as much as any financial asset. One cow is pregnant, roughly 7 months along, which means a new calf in about 4 months if everything proceeds normally. That calf represents potential revenue of 1,200 caps in 18 months, assuming survival, proper development, and stable market conditions. It also represents immediate costs of enhanced feed for the mother, medical monitoring as term approaches, and increased vulnerability to predators attracted by birthing activity. The calculation is simultaneously optimistic and pessimistic. Hope and worry balanced on outcomes I can influence but not control. The Mojave sun rises higher, heating air that already tastes of dust and distant radiation. The Brahmin drift towards shade, seeking relief from temperatures that will reach dangerous levels by afternoon. I've lost animals to heat stroke, another cost of ranching in an environment that was barely habitable before nuclear war made it worse. Water consumption spikes on hot days, straining my well capacity and forcing decisions about whether to drill deeper at costs that might exceed the value of preventing heat-related deaths. This is the reality of Brahmin as capital. Living assets that require constant investment, generate unreliable returns, and transform your life into an endless series of calculations about whether the next expense is worth the potential benefit. Every decision matters. Every mistake costs money. Every success feels temporary because new threats and challenges arrive continuously. The barons face the same basic problems, but solve them with resources that make their solutions more reliable and their failures less catastrophic. I'm 43 years old, which means I probably have another 20 years of physically demanding labor in me before age makes the work impossible. If I maintain current profitability, I'll accumulate maybe another 100,000 caps over that period, which would give me about 250,000 caps total at retirement. That's enough to buy into a settlement, secure housing and basic services for maybe 15 years, and leave something small to hypothetical children who probably won't exist because ranching doesn't leave time or energy for relationship building. The math suggests I've spent my entire adult life building toward a retirement that's barely adequate and a legacy that will disappear within a generation. The emotional reality is more complicated, filled with moments of satisfaction from work done well, connection to land and animals that provides meaning beyond profit, and stubborn resistance to the idea that barren consolidation is inevitable. Maybe I'm delusional. Maybe I'm just too stubborn to quit. Maybe there's no meaningful difference between those two positions. Somewhere to the northwest, beyond the hills that mark my property boundary, Gunderson's operations are processing thousands of animal through systems optimized for maximum efficiency and minimum cost. His foremen are managing workers I'll never meet, tracking inventory I'll never see, negotiating contracts that will shape market conditions I'll have to accept without input or influence. The scale and sophistication of his operation represents the future of Mojave ranching, and I'm watching my own obsolescence approach with the inevitability of a deathclaw stalking wounded prey. But today, 37 Brahmin carry my brand and generate my livelihood. Today, the fences hold and the water flows, and the animals remain healthy. Today, I'm still a rancher operating an independent business in a market that hasn't completely eliminated that possibility. Tomorrow, the math might finally catch up with me. But tomorrow isn't here yet. And I've learned not to borrow trouble from the future when the present provides enough challenges to occupy every moment and every cap. The sun climbs toward noon, and the work continues. Brahmin need feeding. Fences need inspection. Markets need monitoring. The endless calculations proceed, balancing costs against revenues, risks against rewards, present investments against future returns. This is the livestock economy of New Vegas, measured in breathing capital that converts grass and water into meat and milk and wealth that exists only until the next disaster erases it. This is survival measured in two-headed cows and the determination to maintain ownership of something that matters, even as larger forces work to take it away. My name is Vernon Keller, and I own exactly 37 Brahmin. That number defines my economic position, measures my achievement, and represents everything I've built across years of labor that would have been easier spent in almost any other pursuit. But these are my animals. This is my land, and this is my livelihood. The barons can have the future. I'm focused on surviving today. If you found this examination of Mojave livestock economics valuable, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the wasteland. These aren't tales of heroes. This is the machinery of survival, told by the people who work it, one two-headed cow at a time.